first seminar for this term. The provost is coming, she's a bit delayed, and that's why I'm going to introduce Professor Alan Macfarlane, who's a very old colleague of mine from the Department of Social Anthropology. Alan is immensely experienced, started work actually as a historian on the history of Britain, England, then became an anthropologist and written some classic books about Nepal, and since then he's worked a great deal in China and in Japan, and he's written a whole variety of genres of work, some scholarly and some for the general public and some for children. And so, Alan, welcome to you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Carrie. So, I've got about 40 minutes to talk, to summarise a lot of material. But obviously, if you're interested, I'm talking about a book that has just been published by Cam Rivers Publishing called China, Past, Present and Future, if you've seen the poster, through the eyes of Evariste Huc. Now, how many of you have ever heard of Evariste Huc? Obviously, two. And Reza, obviously, since he organised the session, also was heard of. So there's a gentleman over there, and of course, Carrie. As I will explain, I think Huc is a very great figure, and one of the mysteries is why he's been forgotten, more or less, by modern readers. I'm going to try and deal with three big questions. One is, how can we understand the largest, oldest, and most complex civilization in the world? And if we're standing here, on this black thing, how can we understand the largest, longest enduring, and most complex civilization in the world, namely China? Just to illustrate the size, you get it back to the, I press the wrong forward button. So, this is Peter's projection map of the real size of countries. If you see China up there, if you see its size compared to Europe, it's the whole of Western and Eastern Europe, the Russia up to the Urals, and a bit of the Middle East. It's immense, absolutely immense. How many of you have been to China? Obviously the Chinese here have, but some of the rest of you. So it's huge. It's by far the oldest surviving civilization, 5,000, 6,000, 7,000 years of history, not broken, and it is hugely diverse. So how do you comprehend this? That's the first question. The second question is, how has the modern miracle of China occurred? Modern miracle is, as an economic historian, social historian, who's a historian of the West and studied the Industrial Revolution, what has happened in China in the last 40 years is the biggest economic and social change that has ever happened on this planet. It's about 10 times the size of what happened in the Japanese miracle, because China is 10 times the population, and because of modern technologies it happened much faster. So you're seeing a country which at the end of Mao's time was more or less flattened and has become the second greatest power on earth. How did that happen? It's extraordinary. No one has really satisfactorily explained it. The third question is, what is going to happen now? This is why I say future in the title. The West, and particularly the Anglosphere, is deeply hostile in many ways, at least the leadership towards China, and very suspicious and trying to contain it. And this is a cause of great anxiety to many. But what will China be like when, as is likely, it becomes, along with other parts of Asia, the dominant part of the world? So those are the three questions behind my talk. As Carrie mentioned, I started in comparative civilizational studies in England and Europe. Then I went to Nepal and I've spent many years going to the Himalayas there. Then with Sarah I went to Japan, and we only started on China, as it were, seriously when I was about 60, 2002. But since then we've been back every year, on average, 19 times, and travelled all over China, except for the northwest, Gansu and Xinjiang. And I have travelled with my PhD students, because I don't speak Chinese, and explored, and I've also been a visiting professor at various universities. So though I don't speak the language, I've come to appreciate and learn a lot about this extraordinarily diverse and amazing civilization. And so what I'm going to try and just introduce you to is something which reminds me always of one of my first favourite poems when I was about 10, which is Coleridge's Xanadu. In Xanadu did Kubla Khan a stately pleasure dome decree, where Alph the sacred river ran through caverns measureless to man, down to a sunless sea. The mystery and extraordinary nature, because, as I'll end up saying, China is, in Borges' sense, a tertium orbis. It's a third world. Its assumptions and basis is totally different from any other civilization, and it's because of that partly that it is such a challenge to the West. So, turning to the subject of my book, Evariste Huc. The attempt to understand China through Huc's eyes is part of an ongoing attempt to understand China. I made an attempt in a book that I published in 2020 called Understanding the Chinese A to Z, personal A to Z, which took subjects one by one. So Feng Shui or Yin Yang or whatever it was, and wrote short articles under A to Z, and with the help of obviously Chinese friends. So it's an encyclopedia which sort of captures parts of China, but it doesn't capture China as a whole essence. And so I was looking for some way of integrating all that I'd learned over many expeditions and conversations about China. And so I decided to do what I've done with Japan, which is to find one person in a civilization who seems to understand it from a deep level. Fukuzawa did this for me in Japan. Tocqueville did this for me in America. And I was always looking for someone. And then, in the first year of the COVID breakdown epidemic, my wife Sarah leant into the bookshelf behind where she works and started to read a book by Huc called The Chinese Empire. This is the first volume of The Chinese Empire. And she said, "You must read this, Alan, it's amazing." So I did. And since 2020, I've been thinking about and preparing this book. You need to know who Huc is, although I'll intervene with his predecessor. This is another Huc was a missionary, and this is another great missionary whose work was totally forgotten. There was only one copy of the manuscript. It was suppressed by the Jesuits, as this book was by the Lazarists. But there was one copy in the British Museum which was found about 60 years ago of the travels of Adriano de las Cortes, and we published this about 4 years ago, and of course no one knows about it because we are a small press, but it is an extraordinary book. Joe McDermott, who was an expert on China at Cambridge, who sadly died, said he thought it was one of the 4 or 5 greatest books on China before the mid to late 19th century, alongside Matteo Ricci, Marco Polo and McCartney and others. And I and Joe edited this book, which tells of Adriano's voyage to south of China, Canton. He was imprisoned for a year in China, and he wrote the first anthropological account of China from the lower level of China, unlike Ricci. So it's a very important book, and it set me interested in missionaries and other people. So Huc, as you see, he was born in France in 1813. He joined the Lazarists, which is a religious order based in Paris, and they took over from the Jesuits. The Jesuits were banned in China in the early 18th century, and the Lazarists were allowed in, so he was a Lazarist, and he arrived in Macau in the first year of the First Opium War, 1839. He travelled to Beijing and then to Tartary, where the mission was, and he spent 3 years. He was a superb linguist. He spoke Mandarin absolutely fluently. He learned Manchu, he learned Mongolian, and he learned some Tibetan. He was ordered to explore the Mongol tribes with another member of the order, Gabe, in 1844, and they set out in August. For some reason, they weren't able to go back, so they had to go forward, and they realized the only way to go forward was to move, and I'll show you the map, from Mongolia to Tibet, to Lhasa. And it took, as you can see, a year and a half. One of the greatest ever journeys by human beings. There was one guide, 2 camels, and they went across the Gobi Desert in winter, and then over the high Tibetan plateau in winter. And when it was published as a book called Travels in Tartary and Tibet, it was a bestseller, not surprisingly. Absolutely stunning book. Anyway, they then, in Lhasa, they were told by the Chinese embassy or Chinese consul that they were suspected to be spies, and they weren't to go back to India the easy way. They had to go down the Yangtze and to Canton, which they did for another 6 months. So 2 years travelling right through the heart of China. And they spent 3 years writing travels. He went again to Beijing and left China in 1851, so he'd been there 14 years. He was a Knight of the Légion d'Honneur and won the Montillon Prize, which was the biggest literary prize in China, which had previously been won by Tocqueville and was later won by Pasteur. So he was, at the time, a great figure in France. That's a portrait of Huc. And wherever they went, they had to disguise themselves. So at times he would be a Chinese Mandarin, at other times, as in the first picture of him, dressed up as a Buddhist monk. Here they are in these are fictional pictures, but this is dressed up as a monk travelling. Now, I mentioned the travels. You start down here in Canton, or Macau, and they went partly by sea and then across land. That's the distance between here and, well, further than from here to Istanbul. But of course, that's the easy bit. They then went up into various bits, and then they started across this journey to Lhasa, and then came down the Yangtze and back to Macau. I mean, the total distance is thousands of miles and in very difficult circumstances, you can imagine. This is the later part of they come down from Lhasa and then to Sichuan, Chengdu, and then down here. And Sarah, my wife, has marked the places which you can still identify. All the names have been changed, but these are places you can identify from his account. So the book this is the scheme of the book. Something about the difficulties, the political perils and so on. Something on the methodology, how he investigated and how he understood it, because I think he was a great anthropologist as well as a great traveller and historian, and he used many of the methods. Been trained in the French philosophical school of Montesquieu, Tocqueville and others, and had learned the structural approach of the French, that you look at a civilization as Montesquieu did or Tocqueville did, as a large structure which you try and understand by the relations between the parts and so on. So he was applying the Great Enlightenment vision to a new civilization. He describes the wealth, how the agriculture and agrarian structures work, the fact that China was an immensely sophisticated commercial civilization at the time he was there. I'll talk more about some of these things. Manufacturing China, they were making wonderful products, and then I summarize it in a chapter. Then he describes, or I've analysed him to describe imperial China, how the governmental system worked, the social and legal structures, and summarize that. Then the culture, Chinese as artists and aestheticians, intellectual China, the language and education and so on, philosophical China, not religion but philosophy, and then the arts of healing, and then a final chapter synthesizing it and projecting it into the future. Then later there's some more detailed appendices. So I'll leave that on there. I'm just going to quote a few pieces from this book. It's difficult in a lecture to quote too much, so I'll try and keep it short. So I've mentioned some of the... Gillian, there is a seat for you here. You can't just stand there. We can't have provosts standing while we're all sitting. Come on, come on. I said he is very well qualified in various ways as a linguist. From his education, he travelled very widely, as I pointed out, and he met people from all levels. He was powerful enough to know all the mandarins and the rulers, ruling class level, but he also spent on his travels, because this weren't the only travels, he did others as well. He used to sleep in inns and talk to ordinary people and sleep on the street and so on. So he, like a good anthropologist, he was participating and observing at all levels of Chinese society for 14 years. And he had a fantastic memory. these 2 volumes on the Empire of China and the 2 on his travels were done from memory. There's no evidence that he kept more than a very few fragmentary notes, and so he reconstructed, and it's that kind of reconstruction where he would be in the middle of the Gobi Desert and he'd go into a nomad's tent and then start talking about the history of the nomads, and he would relate the conversation. He said this, I said that. And when he describes, he's a very great writer, when he describes the terrors of a howling storm in the middle of the desert or whatever, he describes it in absolute detail. The wind was coming this way, I was wearing that, I'd moved this, down to every detail. And these were accounts written 5, 6 years later. So he was a really good observer and describer. He was enormously empathetic and sympathetic. Many Europeans, then and now, go to another people and they show no sympathy or empathy or understanding or whatever. But he had one of the main features of the discipline I was trained in, which is an attempt to understand the culture by in its own terms, to project yourself and ask the questions of why do they do this in their own lives. And also to look back on your own culture and see that maybe they're doing something which you disapprove of or think is ridiculous, but look at yourselves. And he often does this. I'll just give you one rather nice example. As one of the 3 or 4 things the West constantly accused China of was foot binding of women. Now, Huc said, yes, of course they foot bind, and of course it's an atrocious habit, and so on. But look at yourselves. And I'll just quote this little bit at the end. The Europeans, besides, have no right to be so very severe upon the Chinese, for they also set a considerable value upon small feet, and many of them subject themselves to pain every day by wearing shoes that are not really large enough for them. What would the Chinese women say, too, if anyone should tell them that beauty does not consist in having imperceptible feet, but it does in having an intangible waist, and that, though it is not desirable to have the feet of a goat, it is to have the shape of a wasp. So the corseting of women. Much of the West at that time still castigates China for being this or that and the other. And he took the other view. He was critical, but he also supported the Chinese against Western imperialism, which was very strong in the Opium Wars at that time. And he particularly quoted a French writer called Remusat, who was the first professor of Chinese in France, who, at great length, and I'll just give you the beginning. They are a singular race, these Europeans, and their proceedings would make a strange impression on an impartial judge. Intoxicated by their own progress in modern times, especially by their superiority in the art of war, they look upon all other families of the human race with supreme disdain, as though they were all born to admire and serve them, and that of them it was written, and this has resonance at the moment, God shall enlarge Japhet, and he shall dwell in the tents of Shem, and Canaan shall be his servant. All must think like them and work for them. They walk abroad upon the earth, exhibiting to the humbled nations their faces as the type of beauty, their ideas as the standard of intelligence, their arguments as the very basis of all reason. Everything is to be measured by their scale, and who contests the justice of this arrangement? Another feature was that, looking deep inside the civilization, he saw beyond the present times. He was there at the lowest ebb of China. This was a time when, from the 1820s, the Chinese economy collapsed for various reasons, overpopulation and so on. But it was also the time of the great destabilization caused by the Opium Wars and the Taiping. And he saw all this. He saw the famines, the poverty, the misery, the backward technologies. But below it, he saw the Chinese people and the potentials of this civilization. He saw the deep roots. He knew Chinese history from the beginning, and so he saw the trajectory of China. His analysis of society, the social system of China, is fascinating. For example, he saw that China is not, as in the West, individualistic. It's what the French calls structural or relational or holistic society. It's all about relations. It's not A or B, it's A in relation to B. He saw all this and understood the Chinese family system very well and the Chinese social orders very well. One bit that I found particularly interesting is the chapter on Chinese philosophy. Now, one of the big threats to the West now is that much of the West is dominated by evangelical Christianity, as you know. And this is based, that monotheism and the other monotheisms are based on the assumption that there is one God and that everyone else should adhere to that religion. And his missionary endeavor was based on going out to bring the Christian religion to them. But what he discovered was a huge shock to him, and a shock to me when I read this, because what he discovered is that there is no God. You've got 1/5 or quarter of the world civilization who not only disapprove of your God, but don't know what you're talking about when you say God. There's no word in Chinese for God, of course, in our sense, but the idea of religion, with a capital R, meaning a set of bundle of characteristics like ritual and dogma and so ethics, there's nothing in China that approximates to that. There's no God-shaped hole because there's no hole at all. So his chapter there, and this is why he was finally destroyed by the Catholic Church. His first book, was put on the Catholic Index of banned books for a couple of hundred years, because he said the Tibetans and the Catholics are more or less the same religion. And that was deeply shocking. His comrade Gabe was banned to South America and died promptly because he memorialized the Pope saying it's a waste of time trying to send missions to China, because you've got nothing to grab hold of. There's no starting point. You can't just say you've got the wrong God. They don't know what you're talking about. And he gives a rather delightful instance of this. Just one tiny bit. Of the urbane and tolerant atheism of China. Although they have thus made a tabula rasa of their religious creeds, the ancient denominations have remained, and the Chinese still like to make use of them, but they are now only the memorials of a feeling long dead. Nothing more clearly indicates this desolating skepticism than a formula of politeness exchanged between unknown persons on their first meeting. It is customary to ask to, "What sublime religion do you belong?" One perhaps will call himself a Confucian, another a Buddhist, a third a disciple of Lao Tse, a fourth a follower of Muhammad, of whom there are many in China. And then everyone begins to pronounce a panegyric on the religion to which he does not belong, as politeness requires, after which they repeat in chorus, and I ask you to forgive my Chinese pronunciation, "Bu dun jiao dun li." Religions are many, reason is one. We are all brothers. Phrase is on the lips of every Chinese. So you have yours, I have mine. You like fish, I like chickens. We're all brothers under the sun. So missions are a waste of time, as he discovered after, and he left the Lazarists late in his life before he died. He has very important and interesting stuff about the political and governmental system. Very, very few people in the West understand the beginnings of how Chinese political structure works or its imperial history. And he gives a very good summary of the systems. For example, one of the fears, I think, of the West in relation to China is that, not unnaturally, we think maybe they will behave to us as we behave to them. We attacked and undermined and tried to grab hold of them for a century or more. Surely when they become maybe the most powerful economic and military power, they will do the same to us. They are an imperial nation, it's the Chinese empire. But when you read Huc, you see that our vision of empire, which is based on the history of the Portuguese, Spanish, Dutch, French, English, and now American, which is to conquer. When you are the richest, most powerful land, you conquer other people's land, either directly or indirectly, economically. What Huc describes is what has often been termed a galactic empire system. China is the middle kingdom. It's the most powerful kingdom in the world. Vast. And it sits in the middle like an older brother. And then round it, as in a galaxy, it has the planets which circulate round. So instead of Mars, Venus, etc., you have Korea, Vietnam, Japan, Tibet, which circle. And it's not in China's interest to make them part of China. China's already overlarge. On the other hand, it doesn't want enemies. So you get what is sometimes called a tributary system, whereby these younger brothers periodically come to China and bow down and give gifts, and the Chinese give back gifts, and the Chinese protect them and they don't attack China. That system of galactic empire is what we now see to a certain extent with the Silk Road and so on. In other words, you make good, strong relations with people around you, but it's not one of conquering them. There were many times when China could have conquered most of the kingdoms around them. But if you look at the last 70 years of our current empire, the American empire, the way it has attacked and destroyed and killed millions and millions of people. Whereas, if you look at, say, 2,000 years of Chinese history, they invaded Burma 2 or 3 times, they invaded Vietnam 2 or 3 times, Korea, Japan twice, but never held them and never did it systematically as they could have done. So it's a different model, and it's one which we need to understand if we're going to live in a multipolar world. The way China spreads, we can see it now in Tibet and in Xinjiang, is Hanization. And he has very good accounts of this because he was in Manchuria. And he says in Manchuria, they've never formally conquered it, but the place is Han now. They don't speak much Manchurian now because the Han have settled it. They come in, they're farmers, they're tradesmen and businessmen, and they absorb it through colonization, which is a different kind of model. I'll have to end shortly, but he has a very brilliant account of democracy in the political system, which is almost identical to the present Communist Party system of delegation of power, balance of power, etc., etc. And he ends up saying China is much more democratic than France. And he will explain why. they have much more press freedom. He starts, liberty of the press is another ancient institution of China. And he shows why the press is much freer in China than it is in his contemporary France. He goes into the military and he says, okay, European weapons and guns can destroy Chinese armies now, but you wait. The Chinese are fantastic soldiers, and in due course of time, they will be the most powerful military in the world. Says the same with the Navy. We've crushed them with our battleships, but they're great sailors, and they have all the qualities of great military people. So watch out. He does the same with the economy. He shows the great design skills, the immense hard work, the collaborative work of the Chinese, and he says that they have the potential to be the workshop of the world. So he does explain a lot about what happens there, and what he does is to show something which I rightly understood, which is that China is like a great tree, vast tree that has grown over 5,000 years. Trees have as many roots as they have branches, as you know. So what has happened in Chinese history is that again and again, China has been chopped down to more or less to the ground. Happened with the Mongolian invasion, Manchu, the Communist Party. And then what Needham and others used to call the green sprouts. It grows up again. And so to understand what's happened in the last 40 years, you have to realize that China has just once again come up, the trunk has come up and the branches have spread out in an amazingly short time. And it is enduring. You can't, short of bombing it into the Stone Age, which is what the Americans planned in the 1950s, 800 atom bombs, but they didn't do it luckily, so China has come back again. So there's much more to say, but I ought to let you have a chance to ask me questions. I just want to end with the penultimate paragraph of this little book, which takes me back to the wonder of Kubla Khan. In essence, what Huc describes is a set of features which have survived into the modern world from long ago. China is like the ginkgo tree, which is in fact a fern, the only one of its species to come from before the age of the dinosaurs, or the age of the dinosaurs, before the last ice age. Like the bamboo, which is neither grass nor plant, China is something incredibly simple, ancient, and of another geological era. China is a surviving civilization coterminous with the ancient pharaoh dynasties or early civilizations of the Indus Valley. We can see this in its social structure, similar to that of the simplest Australian hunter-gatherer. We can see it in the simplicity of its logographic writing system, the only large-scale preservation of such an ancient system that has survived into the world of alphabetic scripts. We can see it in its ancient Taoist shamanic rituals and beliefs. In other words, China is neither pre-modern, modern, nor postmodern. It is a parallel universe, as strange and fantastic as the invisible cities which Italo Calvino describes at the time of Marco Polo. It is a dream or vision of ancient features which cuts across our post-axial categories and our Greek and Christian heritage. 谢谢.
Absolutely delighted to. Sorry, I didn't realise, because when I saw from the invitation that was sent out, that was your name, my name wasn't on it. I assumed that I wasn't involved in it per se, but I misunderstood. But you're very happy to. Right.
This is Gillian Tett, Professor Kings.
Yes, sorry. Well, first of all, apologies for being a couple minutes late. I got called into another meeting, but delighted. And I read the book on a plane recently. It's fascinating. It reminds me a lot of those of you who've studied the area of Alexander David Neal's accounts, which was a huge impact on me, and come from that tradition of extraordinarily bold travelling and exploration that these days would be almost impossible because the universities health and safety laws would stop it immediately, sadly. And I think we really have lost something about that sort of ability to just go out and explore and travel and collide with other worlds as a result. I guess the first question I'd ask you about the book, because I do think it's terrific myself, and I want to hear from the room, is what did he miss out? What did he not write about that he should have done? What was the social silence that he basically failed to talk about?
It's a very good question. I can.
Well, I was a former student of yours, so I learnt the questions from you.
Well, I'll evade your question by answering what he did least well, which I do say, which is aesthetics and art. He found getting inside the Chinese art culture almost impossible. He said when he first saw calligraphy, he thought it was hideous, and then he came to appreciate its beauty. When he heard Chinese music, he just couldn't understand the tonal systems and discordant elements of it. He sort of appreciated some Chinese garden design and architecture, but basically he found that whole part of life impossible to grasp hold of. Did you notice anything that he...
I guess that I thought he missed out. I guess he could have done more on the power structures. That was my main thought.
Well, what he did, I didn't read the passage, but what he did was to explain a system which we also don't understand in the West, because the history of political structures in the world have been of two kinds. Most of the world, including these civilizations in Europe and hence America, have come up a path from Greek philosophy of politics and then through feudalism. Feudalism is a system which was obviously present in this country and across Europe for about half a millennium after the fall of the Roman Empire. And it's a system where invading tribes come in and seize land, and then they know that the only way to rule it is for the leader, who's just first among equals, to give away the land to people below them, who then, in return for protection by the chief, the head, the king, they provide armies and some taxes and so on. So you have a system of delegated power. The guy at the top gives benefits downwards and downwards. Cambridge is a feudal system. The architecture of Cambridge when I came here is the centre, and King's is one part of this feudal structure of delegation of power. The Chinese system, as he describes, is much more centralised. Everything, here in Cambridge Department when I came, you didn't have to tell anyone anything higher up the system. You just did it. You organised your teaching and research and so on. Didn't tell them what you were doing. And so there was power all the way down, a lot of power in a college like this. In China, everything goes up to the top. And so the top is very powerful, also because, as in America, the symbolic power and the executive, military and other power is one. Unlike Japan, where you had a shogun and emperor, Chinese system, the emperor is everything. On the other hand, what he shows is the emperor is nothing. Just like poor Gillian here, as Provost of King's, and who knows you can't really do anything here without a great deal of hassle persuading people around you, because power is diffused and so on. Chinese emperor was like that. He had the mandarins and eunuchs around him, and then these huge provinces with powerful governors and all the Mandarin class and so on. So he could say, do this, but as the old Chinese saying was, the mountains are high and the emperor is far away. Do what. So this kind of balance of power, he gives other examples, leads to a system in which there is a great deal of liberty and distributed power, despite being this kind of imperial system. So he could have paid more attention to it, because he wasn't really part of the power structure at all. He just learned about it from the Mandarins.
Yeah. No, I thought it was obviously fascinating. I thought your points about the difference between different types of empires and colonialism and the projection from the West onto China and assuming that they will behave as the West has behaved with its empire is absolutely fascinating. But right, any questions? And it would, as ever, be courteous but not compulsory to briefly identify yourself. Reza.
Oh, thank you very much. My name is Reza. I'm with my colleagues Francisco and Angus. We are running basically Synchros here. So, welcome again. Professor Macfarlane, when you talk about China and of course the self-critique of Huc, looking at the civilization, back at home, European culture, it reminds me of Francois Bernier, who also went to India a little bit earlier and talks about the Mughal Empire and then the political structure. But that he does not actually criticize European culture at all, but he put every blame on the Eastern one. But that's one. But then also when you talk about this galactic model, it goes I think very much against what Professor Macfarlane Macfarlane talks about realpolitik, and he says that because we are hegemon, we do all these things. If China becomes hegemon, we'll do the same thing to us. I think it's a lack of understanding China is very deeply embodied in our political theorists here. So my question is basically is that when you talk about the Huc, of course in that society, he was suspected of being spy, so he went back to India and comes back. How he actually could make that things again? Because he was suspected and is working on society, trying to get more information and then write about it. So how could he deal with the authorities around that they were suspicious of him? And the second thing, how could he live basically? How could he live? So where he would get his money, his expenses and all those things.
So basically, why wasn't he arrested and executed?
Yeah.
Well, I sort of explained it in the chapter on the political perils. His predecessors, his direct predecessor, Terboy, was crucified. But some people say just after he arrived, and some people say just before he arrived. And although the Lazarus was sort of omitted, there was then a decree a few years before he came saying no missionaries. But in Macau they were sort of vaguely tolerated. But whenever he went anywhere, as I mentioned, he had to dress up. When he went to Beijing, he dressed up as a Mandarin because he would have been stoned by the people or he would have been arrested. And when he was the Lhasa, the Chinese ambassador in Lhasa arrested him and said, "You are a French spy and you've got to go down the Yangtze and been tried in 2 or 3 places." We've got the end part of the book is the account of the 3 trials that he went through and the memorial or memorandum that was sent to the emperor describing what they'd found, which they couldn't find anything particularly. He was shown the instruments of torture as he went into the first trial, but then they had a philosophical description about religion and life and intellectuals discussion, and they said, well, they can't find anything particularly. We know they're doing some good. Let him go on to the next place. So they went down, but basically they had to conceal themselves. As for the finances, that came from his order, and they sent money out to Macau, and then he was paid.
The question over there.
Given that your book addresses the future as well, I suppose Western fears of China concentrate on its ambitions towards Taiwan. How does the galactic relational empire explain the Chinese ambition to reclaim Taiwan?
Well, a lot of people would say you said reclaim.
Yeah.
They don't reclaim. It is Chinese.
So, sorry, that's really what I meant.
So their view is that it's perfectly fits with the galactic thing. Taiwan can be pretty independent and it can get on and make money and it's useful for China. But with the galaxy, if Mars or Venus suddenly decides to clear off, the galactic empire has an interest in not letting it clear off. Firstly, and this is what, of course, is behind American policy, if they can get one planet to clear off, then maybe other planets will have the same idea. So China will fall apart because the bits, Hong Kong and the rest of them, Xinjiang, will all fall off because the first planet they've seen, it's escaped. So maybe we can do that as well. So China is not going to invade Taiwan if nothing, the status quo is contained. If the Taiwanese declare that they're clearing off with support from America, who knows what will happen. But they're not interested in conquering it. One big change that people don't notice is that when all this began, or say 20 years ago, Taiwan was pretty important for the Chinese economy. Now it's nothing. Shenzhen, city of Shenzhen, which has gone up from 26,000 fishermen 40 years ago to 26 million people now. The economy of Shenzhen is equivalent to the whole of Taiwanese and Hong Kong combined. One Chinese city. Guangzhou, two Chinese cities is equivalent to Britain. Taiwan is, and also now that the main reason they particularly needed economically Taiwan recently was chip manufacturing and so on. Americans have destroyed the are destroying the Taiwanese chip manufacturing by forcing them to go to America or whatever. But it's not working at all. For example, a friend of mine went into a chip manufacturer in Shanghai recently and looked at the people sitting around making the 3NML and whatever chips, and they're all Taiwanese. They paid them better and they came there. So China is now very shortly going to be the top chip manufacturer in the world, and so Taiwan will be useful. They love Taiwan because it's preserved a lot of ancient Chinese culture there and so on, and they feel they are younger brothers, and they'd be very hurt if they distance themselves. So that's how I think it fits into the galactic model.
Thank you. I should have said I'm Richard Reed and I'm a visiting fellow.
You're sorry?
My name is Richard Reed and I'm a visiting fellow. I should have said.
Thank you.
Question back there.
Yes, one thing I get from this is China's very monolithic, and yet China is extremely multi-ethnic. There are reckoned to be 250 languages spoken in China, and historically it's very interesting to try and understand the relationship between the Central Han and these 249 other ethnic groups which are living in China. This image of monolithic China really doesn't play very well with me personally.
Well, that's fascinating. China officially has 56 ethnic groups, but there are many more because, for example, the Miao are 3 or 4 Miao groups, and there are many that aren't counted. 100 million, well over 100 million of the inhabitants of the People's Republic are ethnic minority groups, which is equivalent to most of the minority groups in the world, 100 million of them. They all speak different languages, have different cultures and histories. Even within China, within the Han, southern China speaks different language, or parts of it, to northern China and so on. And that is one of the great fascinating things which is partly explained here. How does this multi-ethnic, multilingual society, how has it survived on and off, certainly since the Qin Emperor united it 2,200 years ago? And the keys to this, it's very simple. I mentioned that China is the simplest of civilizations. China is anthropologically incredibly simple. It's united by about 3 things. One is language. Now, many languages and so on, but Mandarin is something that everyone has to learn and speak. That means that if you meet any Chinese anywhere in China, you can communicate, sometimes drawing the symbols and so on. So language is the one thing that's really unified China. The second is this imperial system, where every part of China is on this long chain up to the middle and down to the bottom. And the third is philosophies, because nearly all, but not necessarily minorities, are subscribed to the Confucian philosophical system, and to a certain degree to Taoism and Buddhism as well. So they are, and then of course, unlike most countries, there is this Han. Now, Han it's very difficult to, I don't really understand Han identity, but one of the surprising things that Sarah and I encountered when we first went to China, we would talk to people and we'd say, well, what are you? And they'd say, well, my father is Tuja, my mother is Han. I had to decide what I'd like to be. Much better to be Tuja because I get better educational facilities as a minority and I can have more children. So they opt for being a minority. So ethnicity is very fluid as well in China. But it is this extraordinary combination of vast complexity and size. I mean, it's like Poland and Portugal and Ukraine, or whatever, coming together and working as one unit. And how they've held it together in that way is a miracle. Unity in diversity, I suppose.
Any more questions?
Alan, Sherry Cooper-Coles from the China-Britain Business Council. Next week, the Foreign Secretary, David Lammy, is going to China in the footsteps of Abe Huc. One of the things he's launching next week is this audit of UK-China relations. And that is likely to conclude that at a time when there are just 300 British students in China, and according to the Chinese ambassador, some 200,000 Chinese students in Britain, including many in this room. What lessons would you draw from this for our sadly declining understanding of China, apart from getting us all to read your book and his book? There is a great deficit now in understanding. The Chinese know far more about us than we know about them, and it needs rebalancing, and Huc has something to tell us about that, I would have thought.
Indeed. I mean, I often say this, when I lecture a lot to Chinese students, and in England, if I said, can you tell me something, if I was giving a lecture, and I introduced Tocqueville or Montesquieu, or even Jane Austen, to English, well, not Jane Austen, those two, to an English audience, there would be blank faces. Who is Montesquieu? Who is Tocqueville? I lecture to Chinese audiences, and they say, oh yes, spirit of the laws, separation of powers, and so on, if I ask them. They're far, far better educated about us. I mean, for good reasons, because the West has flooded in and they want to know about us, than we do about them. And I give the other example. I mean, our politicians, as you know, until very recently, have been very, very hostile to China. And it's been one of my little dreams to get, you know, Tom Tugendhat and Duncan Smith in a room with me. Say, well, okay, you've been preaching anti-Chinese hate for the last 10 years. Do you know about China? Have you been there? Well, no, you don't need to go to a place. Tell me, answer these questions. Name me one Chinese emperor. Name me one Chinese writer. Tell me what is a characteristic of one Chinese philosophy. They wouldn't know. They know nothing. Absolutely nothing. And with some of them, you wonder if you showed them a world map, they would know where China was on it. So they're at the extreme, but I was the same. I mean, why complain? Before I went to China or Japan, I didn't know where Japan was on the map the first time I went there. I had to find it on a map when I went in 1990. Before I went to China, I had the stereotypes that all of us carry in our minds, you know, Chairman Mao suits and little red book and maybe a famine here and whatever. They're absolutely filled. I'll give you an example. A very close friend of mine, who's one of the leading intellectuals in Britain, I asked him whether he would ever go to China. And he said, no, they spit in the streets all the time there. I don't want to go to a country that spits in the streets. And this was, you know, 2 or 3 years ago. So we carried this bundle. And the first part of my book on A to Z, there are 2 chapters on why the West hates China. The Chinese octopus, which consists of crime and violence and opium and prostitution, is going to encircle the world. Cartoons of the 19th century. And these hidden stereotypes, you just watch the BBC, just watch Channel 4, you watch the coverage of the Hong Kong riots, you watch the Xinjiang coverage. It's extraordinarily biased. 3/4 of it rubbish, and the rest biased. So it's not surprising that the general population should be both not educated and also when they are educated they've got that stereotype. When I talk to my family, I have to explain to them because they've been watching television and they've been reading papers, and they get this negative view of China. And that's perhaps the last thing I'll say in relation to Gillian, because I think this is very important. We've got a very interesting speaker coming here soon who's done a great deal to help us understand other cultures and so on. The Nobel Prize-winning economist Jeff Sachs. He's been writing a lot about how we misunderstand the threat of China and so on. He concentrates mainly on the economic and the Thucydides trap, the idea that someone like America cannot abide the fact that another country may become richer or more powerful than that. This is about power. I think equally, and I'll talk to him about this, equally is the existential worry we have. Because 2 of the things that China shows to us. One is that democracy, which is faltering here, is not what we thought it was. It's not only faltering here, but a plank of what I was brought up to believe, which is democracy brings you wealth. Their joint gurus and teachers, Ernest Gellner, used to say that as long as democracy provides you with a better standard of living, we will subscribe to it. As soon as it fails to do that, people will question it. And part of that belief was that if a country goes down the democratic path, it will become like us and rich and capitalist. China is a devastating counter-example. Of course, it's absorbed a good deal of capitalism and quasi-democracy as well, but it is an alternative philosophy. It's socialism. And to be faced with something so successful and yet not our kind of democracy is a great existential threat. The other is to do with religion, because if you are a born-again Christian or any kind of fundamentalist in the West, and you come across a country, as I explained, which seems to exist perfectly well without God, makes you a bit nervous. Perhaps this will catch on.
Well, lots of ideas to unpack there. Ken.
I just wanted to give my limited experience of China, because when Alan said 1990, my limited experience goes back to 1989, when I was in Beijing for a conference on Chinese information processing. Quite by chance, I designed some very, very early characters which weren't in the standard set, just for friends of mine who were geologists, very early plate tectonics people. And on our way, we left China, we left Beijing and flew out the day before Tiananmen Square. And the first place that I visited was Suzhou. And the point about that was that the old museum with the Confucian tablets was still open, and I went down and saw the world of Confucius, and came up, and the next day I went into the centre of Suzhou, and there was the Buddhist monastery, and on Buddha, there's quite an early thought for the Chinese, but as you followed the path that led you down to the monastery, you walked along the old Confucian tablets, and those tablets were laid about 100 years before the birth of Muhammad. And it makes you realise that the culture in China goes back such a very long way. Xi'an, I thought, was one of the greatest places I've ever visited, actually. So that's all I wanted to say, but it was such an early culture.
It's incredible. You can't, standing here, you can't imagine the size, the scale, and the ancientness. It's just beyond belief. And when you go there and you travel for 6 hours by plane, and you're only gone across a part of China. And as you say, even at the height of the Maoist period, there was quite a lot. I mean, Mao was a poet and interested in aesthetics. There was quite a lot that was still just going, and as soon as he went, it all started opening up very quickly, and the monasteries opened up and so on.
Right, now I don't know what time we're scheduled to carry on until.
No, we should stop now.
Yeah. I was going to say one little tiny coda, which is, as some of you may know, we had a filmmaker who came up on Sunday who did a couple of screenings of a documentary film he'd made by embedding himself in the Taliban for a year after Kabul fell, and basically doing a fly-on-the-wall documentary of the Taliban's efforts to turn their ragtag, so-called flip-flop army into a more serious structure. And one of the really revealing comments, well, two really revealing moments, one is at the end of the movie, on this fly-on-the-wall thing, they show the military display a year after in Bagram Air Base, and there's a large delegation of Chinese officials sitting there watching it all. And the other relieving moment is at one point the Taliban are talking amongst themselves about, whether they can get the Black Hawk helicopters flying or not. And one of them turns around and says, "Whatever you do, don't embarrass us in front of the Chinese." So Reza's nodding because he was there at the documentary. But anyway, but it shows how, the power structures are changing in the area, the orientation's changing, and if you take a step back and take a 3,000-year view, this is part of an ebb and flow. I know there's lots of disagreements about what China is or is not doing, and we very much welcome having that open debate. But certainly the account that you've written about provides a very interesting window into a story that most of us didn't know about his life, and a very useful addition to the whole discussion around whether China in the future. So thank you very much indeed. As those of you who have been here just today, you may not know that Reza organises the Silk Road seminars every week, or the group organises, as a group, Francesca as well, organise Silk Road seminars every week on all aspects of Silk Roads, which in many ways I like to say was one of the world's first proper bursts of globalisation, and globalisation in a positive way, where people learned to trade with each other, swap cloth, spices, ideas, words, cultural creativity and all that for the good. So let's hope that we can keep recreating that in the current era, because heavens knows we need it. Thank you.
The other thing I'll mention is that this is the first of 2 talks I'm giving. They won't be the same. The next will be shorter, you'll be glad to hear. But it will be followed by drinks. So even if you don't want to hear me talking, you will get some free wine if you hang on. it'll be actually next door in
Yeah.
the
You're all
provost.
warmly welcome. There's just literally next door in the provost drawing room at, I think it's 4 o'clock?
5 o'clock.
5 o'clock, sorry, yes.
And it's an hour and then drinks afterwards. I'm talking about this book as a book launch at that time. Thank you.
If I can add just one more announcement. So the